Hi everyone, and welcome back to our R tutorial series for Climate Mathematics Theory and Applications. In this video, we'll be covering vectors and matrices. It will correspond to section 2.2.6 in the book, and this will be part 1 of our series on vectors and matrices. R is a vector-oriented language. Every value is placed in a column vector with n number of rows and one column, such that its dimensions are n by 1. And all this notation is referring to is that we have n number of rows and one column. Knowing that, let's create a single row column vector attributed by its dimension of 1 by 1. We'll assign 4 to the object x, and imprinting that in our console, we get the value of 4, obviously. Now the interesting thing to note is that even though this is a singular value, it's still denoted as a 1 by 1 vector, as you can see by the 1 in brackets. Now what these brackets indicate below here in the console is the row position of this element. And since we created a 1 by 1 column vector, this is going to be row number 1. Since singular values can be called a 1 by 1 column vector, let's create a 10 by 1 column vector where we have 10 rows and one column. We'll be using the C function to assign those elements to each row position of the column vector. To get familiar with the C function, we'll call the help function, and as you can see here, using the RStudio interface, we have documentation on the C function. So the help function is extremely helpful if you run into problems with syntax, if you want to see documentation or uses or arguments for a specific function. So if you use the help function, you can see a lot of documentation, syntax examples, and arguments for different types of functions you encounter in R. So it's a useful function to have in hand. Back to creating our 10 by 1 column vector, we're going to assign this to the object myVec, and using the C function, we'll assign the values from 1 to 10, incrementing by 1. We'll just print this in the console, and as you can see, myVec is a vector with 10 rows and one column. And the way that we can see that or view that, not in the console but instead in a separate tab, is we use the view function. And this will give you more of a perspective on the column vector itself. So here we have one column with 10 different rows, and within each of those rows are our elements corresponding from 1, 2, 3, 4, all the way to 10, incrementing by 1. In the previous video, we went over sequences and functions. Now we're going to use a sequence to actually fill the elements of a vector. In this sequence, we're going to be starting at 1, ending at 20, and we're going to be incrementing by 2. We'll assign to our object and call our object myVec2, and it's going to contain the elements from our sequence starting at 1, ending at 20, incrementing by 2. So let's run that. And here you can see in the console the column vector that we created. And just so you get a frame of reference, this is what it would look like if you opened it up in a separate tab. So here you can see 10 rows, one column, with each element corresponding to the parts of the sequence that we defined to fill each row of our column vector. And since in the last video we went over sequences and functions, it's appropriate to cover what a function is again and how we can use a function to input values for some variable. In this case, we're going to be dealing with a univariate function. And what we're going to see here is how we can use a function to fill values of a vector, and in this case our function is going to be computing a circle's area and its circumference in order to create a ratio of area to circumference. We'll call this function FCT1 or function1 abbreviated. It's going to be a univariate function of R with R standing for radius. Our arguments for this function, we're going to create two different objects, area and circumference. And remember, area is pi times r squared. Be sure to include the multiplication operator in there, because if you remove it, R will think you're talking about a single object. So always be sure when you're multiplying or dividing, adding, subtracting, that you include the operator. It's very important. So we'll define area. We'll also define circumference. And circumference of a circle is 2 times pi times r. And we're going to return the ratio of area to circumference. We'll run this entire function. And as you can see over here in the environment section of RStudio, we have fct1 as a function, and it's going to be a univariate function of r. Using our custom function, we're going to create a column vector called myvec3, and it's going to have elements resulting from the values of r that we generate from a sequence. So we're going to have r values of 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, all the way to 19, and the way that we can specify that is by calling the sequence function starting at 1, ending at 19, and incrementing by 2. So when we create our vector object, and it's going to be called myvec3, we call our custom function, fct1. Within that function, we want to choose r values from 1 to 19, incrementing by 2. And here we have our column vector, myvec3. And that concludes part 1 of our tutorial series on vectors and matrices. In part 2, we'll be looking at operations on vectors and organizing, editing, and subsetting pre-existing vectors. See you soon.